if God told us that it would not be just for the sins of the father to be put on the son, how do we explain generational curses? I guess where, like for example, God cursed Esau and sent his family out, or things of that. Those are the arguments that are being presented.
I'd have to see is there something in the Bible that talks about a generational curse. I know the Bible talks about consequences that will go to the third or fourth generation, but that's just general true cause and effect, right? If I'm an alcoholic, my children are going to suffer, and maybe their children will suffer too. But if you mean a curse like a mystical kind of thing, that okay, God's going to put some sort of curse on people against their will, is that what you're saying?
Well, mainly like the Israelites were stuck in Egypt for 400 years. So like, why would God punish generations after the original generation that was not following God's words?
You know, one of the answers that it's an interesting study is on epigenetics, the Human Genome Project. So many people I could quote, but basically Francis Collins, I was actually in Dr. Collins' home when I was writing the first God's Not Dead book. But basically there are consequences that happen to our DNA, genetics that happen to us. So what happens is there's certain behaviors that can be passed down. So one way when I'm talking to people about generational consequences, that there are things that we can do or that our predecessor, that our forebears have done that can somehow get genetically passed down. That's an interesting study. I'm not an expert in that field, so I just stop at that little layman's kind of description. So I think the Bible is trying to tell us is that what we do now has enormous consequences. My 5 children, the way I act, what I do, has enormous consequences on my children and my children's children. And so it isn't really about punishing them. It's about saying that we can choose our actions. We can choose it, but we can't choose the consequences. And so, Frank, why don't you show? I think this is an important thing about the ripple effect. And maybe that, if you don't feel like it fits, but I'm kind of prodding you because I know some of the things that you talk about. Just about, and this ripple effect, just talk about how it goes in either direction.
Yeah, well, let me see if I can get a visual of this, because I'm a visual person. One of the things we chose not to talk about with regard to evil today is this, just because of time. But if this is all of life, then most of us don't get justice. There's a lot of people that aren't compensated for a right they've done, or people who do evil aren't punished for the evil they've done here. If that's all there is to existence. However, what if life doesn't end at the tomb? What if life continues? Then that means that everything we do here can ripple forward into time and also into eternity. In other words, let's go back to the shooting, the tragic shooting here. We may look at that shooting and say, okay, I know why God allowed it, because He allows free choice. But I can't see any good coming out of that shooting. And yet the Scriptures say that good will come out of it to those that love God and are called according to His purpose. So how do we justify this? I can't see any good. Well, because I can't see it, does that mean there is no good that comes from it? No, I'm finite. God is infinite. I can hardly remember what happened yesterday. I don't even know what's going to happen tomorrow. But maybe a tragedy like a shooting or a baby dying can set forth a series of ripples that actually cause a great evangelist 500 years from now to save millions of people. I can't see how that ripples forward, but God can. So when I look at something that's completely tragic, and I'm going, I can't see how good can come from it, I know why I can't see how good can come from it, because I'm finite, God's infinite. God can see, and so He can bring good even from evil. And in the same way, Rice was saying, this works the other way too. I could do something evil, and it's going to ripple forward to affect people in a negative way as well. So when you look at the ripple effect, you realize there's a lot more that goes unseen. In fact, Quick story, my wife's grandfather, great-grandfather, was a major general, was in World War I. Before he was in World War I, he went to West Point, and he grew up in Texas. And so to come to the academy, he got to the academy early, and he heard that there were some people there that were going to haze him. In fact, they were going to throw him in the lake in his uniform. And he heard about this, and he went to his roommate, and he said, this is before class started, and he said, hey, you got that pistol? You got a pistol that I can borrow? He said, sure. This is about 1885. He's walking along the lake near West Point, and he sees a posse of guys coming at him, and he knew the leader, who didn't like him. And the leader came up to him and said, did you call me a blankety blankety blank? And my wife's great-grandfather said, no, I never called you a blankety blankety blank, but I am now. And the guy started coming toward him. And so great-grandfather took out the pistol and he said, you come any further, there's going to be trouble. Guy kept coming, so he shot him. Just shot him. And he said, for some reason, all the posse just stayed with the guy, and I walked right through him. And I walked down to the jail, and I went to the jailer. I said, hey, I just shot a guy because this happened, and here's my gun. And the guy goes, I guess I got to lock you up. So he puts him in jail. He becomes friends with the family of the jailer. And he says in his memoir, it's going to be anticlimactic at this point, he says in his memoir, it went to trial, and the verdict came down not guilty, I guess as a result of self-defense. And so he went back to West Point, and he eventually became a major general. His portrait is hanging in the Texas State House right next to George W. Bush. Now, why do I tell you that story? Because I would not be standing here right now if her great-grandfather didn't shoot some guy in 1885. Why? Because that rippled forward. His life was altered from that point. In fact, everything we do, our life is altered for the future, right? Things ripple forward for good or for evil. This is why you can't say there's no reason I can't see any good coming of that. You can't. You can't know that. God can bring good from stuff that we don't even see. By the way, we see an example of this in the Old Testament with Joseph. What happens to Joseph, you Bible scholars in here in the Old Testament? He's sold into slavery, right? What happens? He goes to Egypt. He comes to prominence in Egypt, and he has a whole bunch of grain set aside. The very family that sold him into slavery comes to Egypt to escape the famine, and when Joseph sees them, what does he say? You dirty rats, you're going to pay now. No, what does he say? He says, what you meant for evil, God meant for good, the saving of many lives. The evil that Joseph's family perpetrated on Joseph rippled forward in their own life to help them. You see the ripple effect? Most of the time we don't see it like that. But it's there. Make sense? All right, thank you.